Hello and welcome back to another edition of Press Pass on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's news project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Thursday, June 20th. It's also a great pleasure to be joined today by Ethan Weinstein, who is the education reporter at VTDigger. Ethan, great to have you with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Andrew.
Um, I've enjoyed reading your work for quite a while at VTDigger. It's always been quite interesting, and I appreciate you making the time for us today to talk about some of the stories you've been covering, and particularly the situation coming out of Montpelier this past week, this past Monday on June 17th. As we all know, the legislature had a veto override session where they overrode, I think it's six of Governor Scott's vetoes. One veto on the data privacy bill was not overridden, but there are several that they did take on, and I guess I thought our focus today could be around one that I think probably got the most attention, at least leading up to the veto override session, and that's the so-called yield bill, or the bill that raises the amount of money that the state needs to pay for education costs. The various school districts vote on their school budgets in March town meeting. Most of them usually pass, although this year a large number didn't because of the projected school budget increases. Um, but it's part of the, I guess, very complicated way in which Vermont funds public education. And I think I'll just stop there and ask you if you could maybe walk us through what's in the yield bill. It did, as I mentioned, get through. Governor Scott was a little upset by it. It projects a nearly 14% property tax increase on average. Not every school district would be paying 14%, but his point was that that's a higher number than many households around the state could probably sustain easily. But what did we have going on here with this yield bill?
Sure. So every year the legislature passes a yield bill. It's considered a must-pass piece of legislation because it's key to how we fund our public schools. Generally, it's something that might make people's eyes glaze over. It doesn't tend to be controversial. Basically, it takes into account uh, how large are the budgets that schools are passing. In order to create the bill, we need to wait for schools to have passed their budgets for the most part, so we have enough information to determine what do property tax rates need to be in order to raise enough money. Um, there are different rates set for people who own homes that are worth over a certain value or who make over a certain income. Then there's a separate amount paid by people who their income qualifies them for some sort of tax credit. And there's a separate rate for people who own second homes or rental properties or businesses, forms of property that aren't primary residencies. But as you mentioned, Andrew, this year the yield bill took on some new significance. It didn't just include setting those rates because, in large part, the cost of education is going up so much this year. The latest numbers I've seen suggest we're going to be spending just under $180 million more than we did last year. That necessarily causes a large spike in property taxes. And as you mentioned, many feel that increase is unsustainable, be they Democrats in the legislature or Republican Governor Phil Scott. So there's a few pieces in the yield bill this year that wouldn't usually wind up there. One aspect is increased revenue. So there's two taxes included in the yield bill this year. One is a surcharge on short-term rentals. I believe it's 3%. So if you are, going to rent an Airbnb, there will be a little tax added to the bottom line. Um, a second new source of revenue included in the bill is it's sort of um, convoluted to put it this way, but it's actually removing a tax exemption for certain softwares accessed over the internet. In, I guess, industry lingo, they're referred to as SaaS or software as a service, stuff like TurboTax that had been excluded from the sales tax, and now it will no longer be excluded from the sales tax. Taken together, those are projected to raise about 27 million, and that will be continued revenue added to the education fund. Um, yeah, so that's part of what made this yield bill unique. I mean, the bill also looks towards the future, and that's another way that it is a bit different than in years past.
So what was driving the increase in the expenditures so much, to push it up? I mean, initially, over the winter, we were looking at a 20% increase. Uh, what new expenditures are going on in education spending that, push the dollar figure up so much higher than in years past? Was this COVID related stuff or something else?
So I think we have a, a pretty good grasp on what's driving costs, although not a fantastic grasp. But one thing that's been interesting to me this year covering this issue is, I guess, how few resources are devoted to understanding the economics around education. There's, you know, this is sort of a blunt description, but there's pretty much one economist that works for the legislature, one economist that works for the Agency of Education. And those are really the two people that are thinking about these issues. Um, so combined, or really led by the Agency of Education, they've sent out more and more detailed surveys to schools trying to figure out why are costs going up and asking them to report on a few different buckets of spending that may be increasing. So we know that one of those big increases in costs are around social and emotional learning. Uh, Teachers report that they're dealing with increased behavioral issues among their students. A lot of people attribute this to disruptions around COVID, going to remote school and then back into person and, you know, modifying the way classrooms work. A lot of those positions, uh, schools had used federal funding to increase their expertise in social emotional learning, hiring experts. Um, and as those federal funds have dried up, schools have absorbed some of those costs. You know, school leaders say, we can't give up these positions. School just won't function in a way that is, providing an education for everyone if we don't have these supports. So that is a large bucket of money. Another is the cost of healthcare. I'm forgetting the specific number, but it's a mid-teens percentage that healthcare is going up. Um, and we know that wages and benefits in education make up about 80% of the cost. And so when healthcare goes up, that's a huge number. We know that our money is in our people, and if those people become more expensive, then the whole system becomes more expensive. A lot of contracts are negotiated on, specified 3-year chunks, or because teachers are unionized, and so you're negotiating positions in en masse, and so wages have also increased. Um, Regular inflationary pressures have increased the cost of education. Everything is more expensive. And that is true in education as well. And then we know that Vermont schools, the physical infrastructure is really lacking. We've got the second oldest schools in the country. The Agency of Education has studied this issue and determined that just to keep things as they are would require about $200 million a year for the next 2 decades. Obviously, we don't have that money. We're not spending that money, but we are spending money just to keep the lights on in a lot of places, and that's not cheap, and it's getting more expensive. So that's added pressure as well.
Yeah, boy, that's going to be an interesting hurdle to get over too. But I guess I wondered, we're looking at a nearly 14% increase here as a kind of on a statewide average. Um, One component of the bill, I believe, sets up a study committee to explore possible alternatives looking forward into the future. Um, I guess what do you have you heard from any of the legislators or any of the other folks over at the education agency about, well, if we wanted to change the way we fund our education system, uh, what would be some of the options? The education system was set up roughly, about 25 or so years ago after Act 60 was passed, then modified slightly under Act 68 in 2003. Um, and that was designed to create greater equity among the school districts instead of having this situation we had in the past where affluent districts could afford to spend more and tax their residents less, and then you had less affluent, often rural communities, forcing very high tax rates on their residents for, you know, something a lot leaner than what a more affluent community could afford. So that was designed to kind of, level the playing field, I guess you could say. Um, how might we go about, kind of maintaining that equity piece, and yet coming up with some way to kind of at least, uh, make the education spending a little more stable or, kind of predictable.
Um, well, I think you've really accurately described the history here and how we got to this point. And as you mentioned, there is a portion of the yield bill that will tasks a group of lawmakers and subject matter experts to study our public education system and come up with short-term cost containment ideas, consider a new funding formula. So as you described, Vermont's funding formula dates back to Act 60 in the late 90s. It is a incredibly idiosyncratic formula. It's often and probably rightly called, overly complicated, a bear to understand. Um, it is also held up as a model of equity, but we know that Vermont spends, among the most per student in the country, and we're really feeling the effects of that this year. I think because these are such complicated issues, an education funding formula is not it's not a simple thing, and like I mentioned, there are so few people with expertise in this topic. It's not as if we're sitting on just a pile of ideas, right? But we know that the majority of states use a funding model that's often called a foundation formula. Um, Really simply put, there's nuances in every state, but the way that this generally works is that states receive or individual districts receive a certain set amount of money, and if they want to raise more money locally, they can raise more money locally. But that set amount of money is determined to be, it could be a floor, it could be, the minimum amount of money you spend. In some places, it can even be a ceiling. You can't spend more than this. Um, and I think that as Vermont considers where to go from here, it's going to be some version of a foundation formula, but the nuances are where this is going to get interesting.
Yeah, so the foundation formula, I think, if I recall correctly, that, basically sent out a certain amount of money to each district based on its per pupil count. And if districts wanted to spend more on their education system or services, that money would then have to come out of the local bucket, as it were. And of course, there are going to be some towns that might be able to afford that sort of thing, and others that won't. But that'll be certainly a very interesting conversation. I'm sure that you and your colleagues will be following in Montpelier.
Yeah, and if you'll let me just jump in quickly, I mean, there that issue of the local bucket, that's where this gets complicated, right? Because the important Vermont Supreme Court decision that led us to Act 60, it specified that uh, we need to create a education funding system that's sort of equally accessible no matter of local property wealth. And I think that as Vermont considers a foundation formula, it will likely need to consider a version, and this has been proposed in the House by lawmakers already, although it obviously didn't come to pass, but a system that provides a foundation, a base for every district. And yet, if you want to spend more, it will likely need to maintain a statewide system of some sort. The way Vermont's system works now is if you want to spend X number of dollars, no matter where you are, you're going to get the same tax rate, more or less. And we will likely need to figure out a way to keep that in place even while moving to a foundation system.
And one of the other options, I guess, on the table is whether or not this is now a point where we need to kind of take the next step on school consolidation, as some of the smaller schools around the state might need to close, and students go to other schools with larger enrollments. You had a very interesting story in Digger a couple of weeks ago about this, where a student, a Yale undergraduate, analyzed the various school districts around the state, and found that the school consolidation didn't really save all that much money, as one might have thought. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, and if you think that the whole idea around school consolidation is something that's going to be receiving a certain amount of attention in Montpelier come next year, as just one way to kind of get a handle on these costs that at a higher level than I think anybody wants to see.
Yeah, so I had the opportunity to talk to a graduating senior at Yale University, a woman named Grace Miller, who's from Newport, Vermont, up in the Northeast Kingdom. And like you mentioned, she studied school consolidations, specifically governance consolidations in Vermont. So consolidating school boards, consolidating school districts, not necessarily closing schools, although that is a portion of it. And what she found was that there were sort of savings in individual buckets of money. Administrative costs were cut when you consolidated governance structures. You relied less on contracted positions. But a lot of those funds wound up being used on other things. So the cost of transportation, for example, goes up. Um, you wind up, she found schools spent more on wages. And so overall, for the taxpayer, they didn't wind up paying less. She found that taxpayers saw a slight reduction in rates first year of consolidation, but afterward, there was no significant savings there. It's important to note, this is the work of an undergraduate. It's not peer reviewed, but it is thorough work and incredibly interesting. I think consolidation will be on the minds of lawmakers and the governor and the Agency of Education as a way to save money. If done well, I think it can save money, but we know that from Act 46, around 2015 through 2018, as districts faced pressure to consolidate, that can be a drawn out process, that there can be a lot of local animosity associated with it. I don't think we know yet the best way to go about these things. And one thing that this woman, Grace Miller, found, there was the quantitative aspect of her study, but there was also the qualitative. She interviewed principals and superintendents who had lived through these processes, and she took away that we didn't really know what our goals were with that consolidation process. Was the goal to save money? I think that was one of the goals. Was another goal just to create a more efficient governance structure? I think it was. Was it to provide better educational opportunity? Yes, probably. But if we don't really define what we're going for, I think it can be hard to achieve it.
Yeah, well, school consolidation is one of those things. I guess a lot of people think in the abstract, well, that makes sense, but then don't close my local school
Right.
because that's where the community identity is, or whatever.
I think it was really fascinating this legislative session as superintendents came into Montpelier to the State House to talk about what they were dealing with locally. You sort of heard this sentiment, not often expressed explicitly, but almost sort of obliquely, that school consolidation is probably an answer, but it's not a decision that can be made locally. People want it to come from on high because they don't want to be the ones making those extremely painful and difficult decisions at a local level. And so I mean, I think the state will need to be that power that decides how this happens. Um, Thus far, I think we only know of one school that's closing, the Roxbury Elementary School. Um, uh, young kids in Roxbury will be attending school in Montpelier. I believe there's some talks of closing schools in Washington County, elsewhere, Worcester and Calais, but that's still an open question at this point. And yeah, I mean, so local districts are never keen on being the ones to take this on.
Right. Every time the issue has come up down this way, it's always been, I think, a very emotional subject where no one wants to see their local elementary or high school be the one to take the to be the one to fold up. And yeah, I think absolutely, if it's left to localities, consolidation will be a very slow process indeed. Um, Before we have to run, I just also wanted to ask you if you could give us an update on where things stand on an issue that seemed like it got a lot of attention last year, and that's the one that kind of grew out of that Supreme Court case, Carson v. Macon, where uh, involved the transfer of public dollars to independent or private religious schools. Uh, I guess I didn't hear a whole lot of conversation about that so much this year. Where does that all stand at this point? Is that kind of been resolved and all that, or is it still going to be, is that going to be a subject that might be lurking in the background to come out next year when the legislature returns to Montpelier?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the Supreme Court decision, Carson v. Macon, it opened up public education dollars to religious schools. That had already been sort of taking place for a couple of years in Vermont before that decision. Um, I, through public records, looked at the amount of money going to private schools and specifically private religious schools. That has certainly increased over the last few years, but for the most recent year that I was able to get data, which was 2023, religious schools received a little more than $1 million. And so, in a system that is more than $2 billion, that is really a drop in the bucket. Um, that being said, it is a concern for a lot of lawmakers who feel uneasy about providing money to religious schools. And one thing that was interesting from my reporting, these are exclusively Christian schools. There are no other religions that have schools that receive public money. Um, the legislature did pass a moratorium on the creation of new private schools that will receive public dollars. You can still open a private school, but it won't be eligible for public funding. But I don't think that there's really much political will or appetite for restricting the private schools that exist from receiving public dollars. I think what we've learned is that you can't say religious schools can't have money, but other private schools can. You would have to do a wholesale, no independent schools can receive public dollars, and that's just not going to happen anytime soon.
Hmm. And one other thing I was wondering about during the pandemic that we saw, I think, a fairly large growth in homeschooling or parents getting together and schooling their kids in little, pods, I guess is one term I heard a lot. Is that something you're seeing going on, or any of your reporting reflecting a continuing interest in homeschooling or growth in that, or is that just again one of those things that happened during the COVID pandemic, and now we're kind of going back to what was more typical in, let's say, 2019?
Mm. It's not a necessarily an area I've focused a lot of attention, but my impression, certainly you're right. We saw a huge increase in homeschooling during the pandemic. I don't think I think that change has continued. I don't think we're accelerating, but I think a lot of people that chose to homeschool are still homeschooling. If I'm not mistaken, the Agency of Education, the year before this school year, really relaxed its oversight of homeschooling, and it sort of passed a lot of uh, the oversight onto the local school districts where a homeschooling family lives. And so my impression is that that system has gotten easier. It's placed a additional burden on local school districts, and we may see the state sort of walking that back a little and increasing oversight to more of where it was during and before the pandemic.
And it just finally, in the last minute or so, the new education secretary, Zoe Saunders, had an interesting introduction to Vermont. She's now the interim education secretary, at least until next year. I guess I just wondered, how are things going for her so far now, a couple of months into the job? She had a kind of a difficult start, but has she been sort of making the case that, yeah, she's qualified and we ought to keep her around?
Well, I will say, Andrew, just as we've been sitting here, my colleague Sarah Meerhoff broke the news that two state senators have sued the governor over his interim appointment of Secretary Saunders. They argue that uh, the governor overstepped his authority by appointing Saunders as interim secretary after the Senate voted not to confirm her. So I think that gives you a little bit of a hint of how it's going. She faces an uphill battle. Lawmakers really heard from their constituents that they didn't think she was the person for the job. I know that she's been out in the field visiting schools, talking to teachers, talking to students. She proposed a whole 100-day plan that she's in the middle of, but I think that things it looks like might be getting harder before they get easier for her.
Wow. Well, I guess my timing was good on that question. I had no idea. Yeah, my goodness. Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there for today, Ethan. But again, I wanted to thank you very much for making the time for our conversation today. Ethan Weinstein covers education for VTDigger. And Ethan, we will look forward to reading more of your stories coming ahead. I'm sure there's going to be plenty to write about.
Thanks, Andrew. This show and your work is really a great resource for local journalism. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And thanks to all of you who have been with us today. Hope you found the program interesting, and we'll see you again the next time. Meanwhile, have a great day. Take care.